Okay. Oh no, that's not what I wanted. There we go. Digital preservation policies as tools for accountability, compliance, and clarity. Before we begin, I just want to say welcome. I'm Jamie Patrick Burns. I'm the digital archivist at the State Archives of North Carolina, and just want to draw your attention to some of our upcoming SERI webinars. On December 9th, we will be having archives responding to outside needs, where two archives will share about how their SHRAB boards are doing some outreach to some outside institutions, museums, local institutions, to share their expertise. And then starting off in the spring 2022, January 11th, we will be hearing from, oh my goodness, I'm blanking on her name, Lori, about the digital preservation capability and maturity model, the self-assessment, and some of the history of the tool, and what we've learned from the past and what we hope to learn from the next one. And we have quite a few more webinars in the works as well, so stay tuned for our further offerings. And just to bring your attention to some of our online content, we've got quite a few videos. We've got FAQs on BitRot up on YouTube. We fairly recently released Making the Pitch for Electronic Records. It's hosted, generously hosted on the Utah Archives website, and there's quite a few other special topics videos there. And then on the COSA website, a lot of our past webinars and other recordings are there as well. So you have lots of things to browse. And we'd just like to thank Preservica, our SERI 2021 sponsor. And finally, what you've been waiting for. So Senior Consultant Amy Rudersdorf has had a career focused on helping organizations preserve and provide maximal access to their digital content with good stewardship practice and quality metadata. She brings a unique perspective to her work after years running digital content creation and preservation programs in academic, government, and nonprofit settings, and with organizations of all sizes. She developed data strategies and processes and coordinated a national network of institutional partners for the Digital Public Library of America, or DPLA. At the State Library of North Carolina, Amy established and directed a nationally recognized digital collections and stewardship program. At AVP, she has consulted on topics including digital preservation, technology selection and implementation, and metadata management for clients including the University of Calgary, Berea College, Paramount Pictures, Library of Congress, and Indiana University. Amy holds a MLIS from the University of Pittsburgh and a BA in English from the University of Wisconsin-Madison. She lives in Madison, Wisconsin with her family and Pitbull. So without further ado, I will hand it to Amy. If anybody has questions, we'll hold them to the end. You can feel free to wait until the end or enter them into the chat, and we will get to them at the end. So let me stop.
All right, thank you, Jamie. I'm going to share my screen, which will just take a second. Hopefully. Okay. All right, so you should see my slides, is that right?
Yes, we can see your slides.
Great. All right. Well, thank you everyone for the opportunity to speak with you today. I'll be speaking on the value of digital preservation policies to support accountability, compliance, and clarity. So a little bit about me, beyond what you just learned. I live in Madison, Wisconsin. And I do like to point out that this is the unceded home of the Kickapoo, Sauk, and Ho-Chunk, and other Native people in what is now referred to as Wisconsin. To learn more about forced removal to and from lands on which you roam, you can check out native-land.ca. I have 5 years of experience working in state government at the State Library of North Carolina. I did not meet Jamie in my time there, so I'm sure things have changed dramatically since I was there many years ago. But I do come to this presentation with an understanding of some of the challenges that organizations of your nature can face in all realms of digital preservation, but also just simply in using the term policy. So if this term comes with complexities at your organization, consider approaching the presentation with the idea, sort of a more general idea of programmatic and documented decision-making. And maybe, think of these policies as small p policies rather than sort of capitalized P policies. And I'll talk more about this as we go. So a little bit about AVP before we get started. This is the company I work for as a senior consultant. We're an information innovation firm, so we offer consulting and software development to help organizations transform how they protect, manage, and use data and digital assets. While we're not specifically or only a digital preservation consultancy, digital preservation is a big part of what we do and a huge part of what I do. Our goal, no matter what area we're supporting a client in, whether it's digital preservation or DAM, is to save time, reduce risk, and provide you with the tools you need to preserve and provide the engagement as your data requires. So just quickly, I like to show people that we're real humans with faces and, that we're exactly that. But many of us come from the library and archives world, so we really understand your perspective, challenges, and needs. And you can see, again, on the right, we have lots of experience in digital preservation, but also lots of other areas too, like we facilitate workshops on strategy and policy development. We do digital asset management. We do technology selection, that kind of thing. So if you're looking for support in any of these ways, we're glad to talk to you. With regard to digital preservation specifically, our work is pretty broad. It ranges from, as I mentioned, workshops. We also do assessments to software development, system acquisition and implementation, wrangling your data, testing your collections. And we are also the company that owns and runs Fixity and Fixity Pro, which you may be familiar with. And then I just wanted to point out in the top middle box in black, you'll see Digital Preservation Go. And this is one of our newest services. It's a very low cost assessment tool to help you with your doing an assessment on your digital preservation maturity. Okay, so I want to start out with a little story. So a few years ago, we worked with a client that had been sort of dabbling in digital preservation, but hadn't really done much. They realized they had tens of terabytes of data in their collections, and they probably had more that they didn't even realize they had. So they did as many organizations do, and they said, oh, we need to do digital preservation. Let's buy a system. This is a technology problem answered by technology. So now they had a technology, but they didn't have a plan. They couldn't figure out where to start, and so they got stuck and didn't do anything. They didn't understand how to get their data into the system in a way that was automated or that they could do in a systematic way. So they didn't do anything. They also didn't have dedicated staff to manage the digital preservation system. So that system just sat there being paid for with nothing in it. And that's a really expensive way to get stuck. And I'd like to say that we don't see that very often, but unfortunately we do. So we worked with them to help them figure out how to migrate their legacy data. But in the process, we realized they hadn't really documented anything. So there was no history and no consistent path to the future. So we helped them to come up with a migration plan for some of their collections and guided them in the creation of some digital preservation policies. So now, 2 years later, they've got formal approval for their policies. Data is being structured more consistently so that the ingest can be automated. And they've hired a digital preservation librarian. They're still loading in their legacy collections because there's no consistency in how they were structured because lack of policies. But now their ability to formalize workflows and these policies is evidence for their administration that the need is real and that they now have the capacity to run digital preservation like other departments are run in the library. Ultimately, the policies gave them the authority to gain the support they needed to have a digital preservation plan built around people and organizational infrastructure, and not one wholly dependent on technology. So let's take a step back now that I've told that story, which I think, again, sounds like a desperate situation that one institution was in. But the reality is that we see this a lot, that people go technology first. Institutions are like, yeah, it's cheap to just buy something. It's a lot more expensive to put in the energy to figure out how to hire people or to write these policies. So let's just buy something. So let's step back first and talk about this concept of policy. So yes, I went to Wikipedia because that's what I do. And there's a definition there that's great. And it says that policy is a deliberate system of guidelines to guide decisions and achieve rational outcomes. I love that thought of achieving rational outcomes. All we want to do is for everybody to understand what needs to happen and for us to all work together and move forward to make those rational outcomes a possibility. So it's really a statement of an intent. It's not directions. It's not workflows. It's a statement of intent or guidance for procedures. And then the thing that changes policies from a little p policies to a big P policies is generally the idea of adoption or ratification by a governance body. So if you can't get that adoption, which would be unfortunate, but is the case in some organizations, doing the rest of this is really key. So you're likely very familiar with the concept of policies, and the fact that I'm explaining them to you may be somewhat frustrating, but I think it's good for us to all start on the same place. And I think your familiarity with policies and their power is probably seen through some of the policies that are on the screen now. We have policies to keep us healthy, to make sure we use technology appropriately, and so we are respectful of one another. When policies are not complied with, there can be consequences, whether to our health and well-being, the safety of our workplace, or the security of our technology infrastructure. In the same way, digital preservation policies inform what needs to happen and why. If we can all agree that work is to be performed in a particular way every time and that everyone clearly understands the guidelines, we can build automations and, more importantly, feel confident that our systems will be maintainable over the long haul and our collections remain authentic. When compliance is enforced, digital preservation policies ensure the appropriate upkeep of our data and digital assets and accountability when things don't go as planned. So it's important to, technology snafu. So think about policies within your organizational ecosystem. You likely have a collection policy, which is part of your organizational infrastructure. The policy framework layer that you see here is where your digital preservation policy falls. It defines services that are performed by humans or machines. In this example, we can see how a policy informs the services that manage the technical infrastructure. Ingest procedures in the service layer are likely documented workflows informed by the guidelines formalized in the digital preservation policy. So to be clear, the policy informs your workflows and procedures. Similarly, something like bitstream preservation actions are the steps taken to preserve the bit streams. These specific actions should not be included in the digital preservation policy, but the digital preservation policy does contain the guidelines that these actions should adhere to. I hope that that's clear. So for example, a digital preservation policy would include a list of formats like .txt files to which your organization is committed to preserving at the bit level. So bit level here just means that if someone gives you a text file, you promise to give them back that exact text file, right? You're not maintaining the content, it's just the bits. These bitstream preservation guidelines answer the question, what needs to be saved and what do we commit to? The actual procedures, how that preservation happens, would not be detailed in the policy. That information would be documented in workflows utilized by staff performing these services. So preservation policy is the policy framework layer, and the actual work to do these actions is in the services layer. So note too that the example here is actually a preservation policy. And something to just think about, maybe your organization already has a preservation policy, and especially if they're sort of policy adverse, you might consider piggybacking on that existing policy so that you don't have to develop and ratify your own completely. So these are a few examples of digital preservation policies that we work with when we work with clients. Some of these have broader scope than only digital preservation, but can have a vital role in how digital preservation takes place at your institution. So for example, you'll see at the top of the list is deed of gift, which people don't often think, oh, that's digital preservation. But the reality is, if your deed of gift does not mention digital assets, then your organization does not have the guidance it needs to manage, store, or provide access to digital assets in collections acquired via that deed of gift. So if you have a donor who gives you a hard drive and your deed of gift does not detail how those digital files should be handled, I mean, you can't handle those digital files. So one of the first things we say to an organization is update that deed of gift so it includes digital assets. And that is like step one in building your policy framework. So likewise, your records management policy may not call out digital assets specifically. And if that's the case, you need to work with, and I know many of you are records managers, you need to work with the appropriate folks to ensure that you're conforming to best practice generally and aligning with your institutional goals, specifically in the stewardship of those digital assets, especially if they're not part of your records management policy. I mean, what it comes down to is if people don't know or don't have something concrete to refer to, it's really difficult to hold them accountable for not doing the right thing. That's if you take anything away from today, that's probably a key consideration. So in short, policies support accountability, compliance, and clarity. They inform action. And if you don't know what needs to be done, the policy should guide you so you don't get stuck. The next few slides detail how this happens. And again, I just want to hit this home, and I apologize if it's redundant, but the policy guides you on what needs to happen and at a high level, how that happens. But it's your workflows and procedures documents that detail who's going to do the work, how that work's going to get done at the very specific services level. So don't mix that information up. We often see policies that contain that information, And because it's so changeable, Tamika works in the organization today, so we write her name into the policy, but she leaves in 6 months. Now your policy's out of date. So those kinds of details just don't need to be in the policy. What you might say is, Tamika, who is the digital preservation archivist, her title gets noted in a policy so that we know that whoever's the digital preservation archivist, these responsibilities are theirs, no matter if someone leaves or that position changes hands. Okay, so first up, clarity. I'm going to jump into each of the words I used in the title and sort of detail what I mean by each of them. So when I say clarity here, I mean that policies should be simply written at a level that the intended audience can understand. And I know that seems silly to have to say, but I think that this is something we run into often too, is policies are written by legal departments. And so it can be very difficult to follow what needs, how do I ensure that I'm doing what I need to do if I can't understand what the policy says? So, keeping it as easily accessible as possible to those people who are accountable or are required to comply with that policy is really important. Terms and acronyms, which we love in the library and archives world, we have to spell them out. We have to include definitions, and jargon should be minimal, if not absent entirely. And this is really hard when we're talking about digital preservation too, because we're talking about things like SIPs and APES and OAIS, and you may want to refer to those in your digital preservation policy. But if you do, you need to define them so that everyone who uses it for guidance understands, and everyone's starting at the same point and ending at the same point as they utilize this document. So the other key here with policies is that they're written down. Oftentimes we have ideas in our head about how things should happen, but we don't document them. And I am not pointing fingers, because if I did, the thumb would be pointing right back at me. But we don't generally like to document things. It's boring. You feel like you've documented it and then it's out of date. But it's so important, because you can't run an organization without these documented policies or guidelines or procedures, especially an organization that needs to run into the infinite future. If someone 15 years from now doesn't have something to look at that was documented from the time you were in your position, how will they know whether that these files are authentic, that they've been maintained over this period of time? There has to be documentation, and a policy is a first step in that. And then finally, a policy should be broadly distributed as appropriate, but easy to find so no one has the "I didn't know" excuse. And I like to point out too that it isn't just your direct supervisor that needs to know about the policy, but everyone in your organization should know. People need to understand what it is you do and what kind of steps you're taking, and that you have made this department a professional department. You've professionalized your work, and one way to do that is with these policies. So my previous comments feed directly into these. Policies are meant to be helpful to communicate how something is or is not done. They enable stakeholders to set goals based on what needs to be done. And the guidance isn't random. It should be directly shaped by your organization's specific needs. It may seem like, University X has this great digital preservation policy, we'll just adopt it. That doesn't work. You need to make sure your policy is specific to your organization's needs. Digital preservation policies may be the same across organizations, or they may be scoped for your particular situation. It's unlikely, though, as I mentioned, that you'll be able to just take that policy from another organization and use it, carte blanche. You have to scope it. So an example here is you may use MD5 hashes when you're doing Fixity, which I assume if you're doing digital preservation, you're doing some sort of Fixity or at least thinking about it. So you might use MD5 hashes while another organization uses SHA-256. In either case, you're both performing Fixity. So your preservation policy is going to say, we perform Fixity. Your policy will say you use MD5 hashes. Someone else's organization will say SHA-256. You're defining the best practice for you. So you may, another example is you would put in your policy how often you perform Fixity. So one organization may perform Fixity every year. Another organization may do it on a rolling basis continually throughout the year. Again, this is the kind of information that your policy should contain. Your policy may also communicate what happens if something isn't done or is done incorrectly. If someone is caught smoking in the stairwell, your no smoking policy probably states clearly the repercussions. Policies shouldn't be punitive, but they do need to be useful so people clearly understand what they need to do to comply with them, and you can follow up with them if they're not complying. And again, this goes back to standardizing the way you do things so that you can begin to automate or decrease the amount of manual work it takes to sort of move your program forward, move your assets, migrate them, or whatever it might be, move into another system. All of that is dependent on ensuring consistency, and you can inform that consistency in these policies. Accountability is really about responsibility. So policies should clarify who is accountable for performing those actions or not. So here again, we're not saying Tamika is accountable. We're saying the digital preservation archivist is responsible. There should be, this doesn't mean you have to point at a single person. It could also just be a department. Maybe IT is responsible for performing Fixity. So just that's what you need to collect and document. Clearly delineate these details. So once you've done the hard work to write and ratify your policy, don't just set it aside. Use it to shape and guide your work, review it frequently, run analytics against it, report up the chain about it, show your organization that you are adhering to the policies yourself and you are succeeding because of them. Once you've got the policy infrastructure, you've shifted focus from a technology-driven digital preservation program to a human-centered program, which, among other things, puts you on equal footing with other units in your organization. You write policies that say what you do, and your colleagues no longer have an excuse to not understand what you do. They may not read those policies, but again, it's down to accountability. You know you've done everything you can to communicate out how your work is done and how you're supporting the rest of the organization. It's up to others now to act on those policies, or at least be aware of those policies. Okay, so I just wanted to wrap up my talk, and I know we're only at about half hour. I've got a little bit more, but I'm hoping we have questions. I wanted to wrap up my talk by showing you the types of information that a couple of these policies should contain. I'm not going to go through this entire list. I'm happy to talk individually offline about individual ones, but there isn't time to go into each of these today. I know that people probably have their own experience writing policies, but I also know that organizations, when we go to organizations and do assessments, everyone says they don't have enough money and they don't have enough staff, but then you look and they don't have any policies to support those findings. So what we see most often is that organizations don't have policies. And we try to help them to, first off, get at least a digital preservation policy in place, if not the others. And as I mentioned earlier, that deed of gift, which I think is super important. But I think it's important to have an understanding of at least these two as you leave this talk today. And I could actually talk about all of these policies for several more hours, but I don't think all of you get as much of a kick out of policies as I might. So I won't put you through that. Okay, so there's a lot of words on the screen, but these are the sections that we recommend a digital preservation policy contain. So some of them are pretty standard. There are things like preservation levels. This is that idea of bitstream preservation that I mentioned earlier. Does a library provide bit level preservation? Are there classes of content that the library would take on future migration or emulation responsibilities for? So this is where that content preservation might come into play. Maybe you are willing to preserve the bits of a Word document, but commit to preserving the content as it appears in a PDF. Those are the kinds of things that you need to define in that section. I also like to make sure there's a mission statement or at least a mandate. It might not be the library's mission with regard to digital preservation. If you've managed to get, or the archive, I'm sorry, this is kind of library specific. If you've managed to get digital preservation into your archive's mission, you win the gold star. I know that many organizations don't consider digital preservation in that mission. And so what you might do is create a mandate or a mission statement for your department, for your records management department, for your archives, whatever it might be. You'll see terminology listed here. Again, that goes back to this idea of we in digital preservation world understand a lot of these concepts, but will your administrator or whoever's signing off on this policy just make this as clear as possible? I'm not going to go through all of these because I think you get a sense of what these probably refer to. I did want to point out this one down at the bottom that's now highlighted in yellow. Governance and institutional commitment. This is how you make sure your policies don't go out of date. You name a position that is responsible for the oversight of the policy. Maybe it's you. And the enforcement, if you can use the word enforcement. I realize it's a pretty strong term, but at least it's enactment. So if your position is noted here as being responsible, now you get sign off from your administration, now you have some authority, right? To make some of this stuff happen. So that's really important. And then also, if this policy goes out of date, someone can say, well, this person's supposed to maintain this. I'm going to go to them and ask what's up. And so that's where a little bit of accountability comes into play too. And I suggest that every policy you write has this governance and institutional commitment section in it. Maybe not exactly as it's listed here, because you'll see on the next slide I have something similar. But making sure that this really does have a name associated with it, I think is really, really, a position associated with it is really, really important to making this both valid and useful over time. So we like to do digital preservation storage policies as well, and you may not know all of the answers to these. You may need to go to your IT department for support on getting some of this information, but some of it should be pretty obvious. So you'll probably have decided pretty early on how many copies of digital assets you want. And so that number of copies is pretty straightforward. Where are the copies stored? You may not have specific locations, but you might know we have a copy on LTO in our In our vault, we've got everything on active hard drives at our IT's offsite location, and we have a third copy in Amazon S3 or whatever it might be. Just having some information. Think about how useful this would be to somebody coming into your position. Talking about the specific devices, I mentioned some there, LTO, spinning disk, whatever it might be. How often are backups happening? I mentioned Fixity earlier. So do you do it? Why or why not? How often? Who's responsible? You see, there's nothing here about how to do Fixity. You will include the Fixity algorithm. That's that MD5 and SHA-256 I mentioned. But you're not saying how it's going to happen here, just that it needs to happen. And then again, responsibility for this policy. Who's the author? Who's responsible for maintaining it? All right, so I've addressed this already, but I wanted to just make sure for those of you who are really concerned about this. If your organization is policy adverse, keep in mind that not every policy has to go through this ratification process. And, many policies may not go through a very smooth ratification process. So don't get stuck if there isn't a decision ratified in the form of a policy to guide your actions. But don't get stuck. That's the key. I see organizations getting stuck all the time. And these policies are meant to get you unstuck. So we don't want you to get stuck in the process of writing a policy. So what some suggestions I have are to call them little p policies or just guidelines. These are guidelines. Try to go through the acceptance process, the ratification process, but if you can't, you can't. And so these become documents for your department. And, over time, you just have to keep working with your administration to get them to understand the importance of formalizing these. Get as much approval or support as you can. If you can get it documented, even better. I love the idea of documenting things. If it's not written down, it doesn't exist. With your internal stakeholders, so maybe other records managers in your department or digital preservation staff, use the guidelines as though they were policies. And then this is so hard to do, I know, and I see it over and over and over again, but I would be remiss if I didn't say that you should really try to stay away from these eternally draft policies. They just have no teeth when you call them draft policies. Call them guidelines, but don't call them draft guidelines. Like, get approval within your department at least to call them guidelines. I know it's sort of a security, and again, if they're draft, nobody's accountable, but the whole point of policies is to have some accountability. So trying to just stay away from that status, I think, is really important. Okay, so I suggest some next steps after leaving this presentation today. I think the first thing you want to do is review any policies you have, just to see if they're up to date, if there's a responsibility, a person whose responsibility mentioned for maintaining or enforcing them. And if not, at least start the process of a formal review. And, you can kind of define what formal means, but again, the more formality, the more documentation, the more teeth these policies have. Obviously, if you don't have any policies to review, I would suggest you draft some. And this process will help you consolidate and document your thinking. And as I mentioned, really move your program from technology focused, right? We have a system, we put stuff in the system, and tomorrow I'll put more stuff in the system, to a human-centered program where people do things with the technology. There are guidelines for how people do their work, so it's easier, more consistent, etc. And then discuss the policies. If you have monthly meetings, maybe bring up a policy and say, hey, let's review this together. Just a reminder, we use MD5, not SHA-256, whatever it might be. They aren't useful if they aren't used, and they're not used if they're not useful. So don't hide them away. And then I would say, as I said in the one above, use the policies. See, discuss policies above. And then finally, assess your policies. So you can think of this sort of as a loop. I guess I could have made a cool graphic that shows an arrow going in a circle, because when you get to the bottom of this, assess your policies, it's basically just start that review process over again. And again, I have worked in state government, so I know policies can get a little dated. And so I suggest you build into your workflows the process of an annual policy review. And the likelihood that you're going to change anything from year to year is probably pretty slim, but at least you can go in and update the review date and feel like what you've done is valid and the work you're doing is supported by these documents. So I think with that, I am done lecturing you about policies, and I am happy to take questions. So I think I will stop sharing my screen, and then you can see me, and we will go from there. Okay.
All right. Thank you so much, Amy. So if you all want to put your questions in the chat, I don't know if people can unmute themselves or not. I don't believe so. So I'll read out questions as they come. We'll give folks a few minutes to think about it and formulate their questions.
Uh-oh.
Clear as day.
So I see a question there. I'm looking too.
Yeah. So Barbara Austin asks, could you provide an example of how you use analytics with your policies? I did not quite understand.
Sure. I think the one that pops into my mind as an easy one is performing Fixity. If you do it annually or however often you do it, you should be able to report back and say, we've done this work, we did it this way, and we found that 98% of our files are just fine. We're doing a great job managing them. But 2%, well, maybe they aren't where they're supposed to be, or whatever it might be. So you'd be able to build some analytics out of that. I'm trying to think of another good example. I think as you standardize your procedures, your workflows, you can start to see more productivity. So you'd be able to pull some analytics out of that too. So thinking back to that story I told you at the beginning, they had all this data, but it wasn't organized in any way. And so they couldn't get it into the system. So they were stuck. So they didn't have anything to report on. But once we could kind of start to help them organize their data into these sort of context structures that allowed them to start importing things into their digital preservation system, now they had some numbers they could report back on. And I really, like, you could say that that's not policy driven, but I would argue that it is. That once they got those policies in place, they all understood what they needed to do, how to do it, and then they were able to do it. And out of that came some real numbers, some real productivity. So those would be a couple of examples. And if other people have ideas, I'd love to hear them.
I have a question. while waiting for other questions, and this might just be, there's no right or wrong answer, but that kind of the line between like policy and procedure or workflow
Hmm.
um, makes sense to me on kind of the more extreme ends as far as like, you don't need to write in who does what. It's more like the position.
Hmm.
But there are certain things as far as like, I don't know, tools you use, or even like the checksums you use, or um, it seems like there's kind of a gray area that's kind of
Hmm.
in between. And I don't know if you could say a little more about that, or kind of figuring out in your organization what belongs where.
Yeah, I think you're right. There is a gray area. I think that I'm going to use Fixity again as an example. So you're going to decide as an organization what hash or what checksum algorithm you're going to use. So that would go in your policy, but you might not put in the policy the tool you're using to perform that checksum. So this year you might use Fixity Pro. But next year, maybe you've got another person who's going to run those from a command line, and you've hired somebody with more technical capabilities who can do more with that than maybe what Fixity Pro allows you to do. So your policy hasn't changed. It's just the way that you've done the work that's changed. And so I think that's a good way to separate it. But I do agree. I think that's probably one of the hardest parts about um, writing a policy is making sure you're not formalizing activities that could be performed in lots of different ways. And this reminds me of when you write requirements for a new technology. And I don't know how many of you have ever had to do this, but you don't tell the vendor, I want you to do this way. What you tell them is, I want your system to do this. Now you tell me how your system does it. And it's kind of the same idea, right? Like you're just writing down, this is what I want to do. And then maybe it's your staff who say, okay, this is how we're going to do it. I don't know. Is that clear ish?
Yeah, I think that that like analogy with the requirements is really helpful.
Yeah.
Yeah, it looks like there's another question. Can you talk a little more about what the teeth of a policy might look like in reality?
Yeah. So I think where this comes into play is when I think you can use your policies to your benefit. So it might be that you say in your policy, we're going to do this kind of preservation, bit level preservation, we're going to do this level, the content level preservation, and we're going to do fixity every other month, whatever. I mean, that is so random. It's your choice. But if you can get your administration to agree to that, awesome. Now you have something to go to them and say, hey, you said we need to do these things. Now you need to support it. So I'm going to need some technology to perform this fixity. We need to think about staffing and how staffing is meted out so that there's someone to do that. And if there isn't someone to do that, then we need to think about in the near future how we're going to make space for a person. I think if you get the key is if you can get someone to sign on and sort of formalize these, then you can use them as tools to get what you need. And it's not as easy as that. I understand it's not black and white, but it's something. It's you can put it in your tool chest as one of the things you can use to gain that support. I'm sure there are lots of other ideas too, but that's the one that comes to mind right now. That's what we see with organizations is that you start to professionalize the work you do. And again, I'm sure you're all doing this in many ways, but specifically in this area, if you can start to professionalize what is still a pretty new area for us in the library world. I mean, we've been in archives world, we've been librarians and archivists since for thousands of years, but digital preservation's really only been around for a few decades. And so I think there's still this need to, I'm going to use the word again, professionalize what we do. We aren't just, slapping things on a scanner anymore. That's not even digital preservation. And so this is a communication tool that helps, these policies can be communication tools that help communicate throughout your organization. Like, hey, we're an important part of this organization too. We're professionals. We do work based on best practice, and these are communicated in these tools. And I don't know if that's a problem in your organization, but I know that in past positions I've had, that has been a challenge. And I think if I had thought more deeply about how to formalize some of the work that we were doing, we might have gotten further in some of our outcomes. While we're waiting for questions, I just wanted to say, Jamie, that I'm very much missing the weather in North Carolina. Today it's very cold here in Wisconsin, and it's days like these where I'm a little nostalgic.
It's a good place to be in the winter for sure.
Mm-hmm.
When you are helping organizations work on their policies, do you tend to, does it kind of start with you giving them something to work with and adapt as their own, or is it like a, go and bring me what you have and find what you have and then kind of craft it, or does it kind of just depend?
Yeah, so it tends to be, well, depends on the organization. So in the example I gave you earlier in the story I told, they had started a digital preservation policy, that sort of trailed off with ... They just hadn't ever gotten around to finishing it. And so it sort of languished as this draft document. And so we came in and we do a lot of research with the organization. So we learn what they're doing, how they're doing it. And then we can either write the policy, as much of the policy as we can as external advisors for them, or give them a template like the one you saw that they can use to write them themselves. In that case, that organization, we actually developed all of those policies for them that you saw on that list. And so we couldn't do everything. We can't answer all of those questions, but based on our interviews and discovery process, we were able to really start that. And so they didn't have to be stuck. They had a starting point. And so, we'd hand them a digital preservation policy that was 3/4 of the way done. And so they just had to take it over the end zone. I don't follow football. I think that's right. So yeah, we might just say to an organization, oh, here are the templates. So I showed you some of our templates today in a very rough way. We don't typically give them away. I mean, we are a for-profit, but if somebody was really interested in something and wanted to talk to me further, we could talk about that. I'm happy to at least have a discussion.
Well, we've got about 5 more minutes, so any other questions are percolating, please feel free to share. Since nobody is asking, I think I feel like getting the things, into the end zone or whatever can feel like almost the hardest part, or
Mhm.
maybe like the follow up and the outreach. Like it's especially if it's a new policy or something. I don't know. I think occasionally I've seen something where I'm like, it looks like it's finished and it's here, but nobody necessarily knows about it or has done, whatever. There was some kind of discontinuity. So it's almost
Mhm.
similar to a draft one. So I don't know if you could say a bit about the kind of like outreach or enforcement or implementation. I mean, that's probably a whole other webinar in and of itself.
Yeah, yeah. I guess I feel like if you've gone to the trouble of doing all this work, like talk about it. And if you have opportunity, if you have, internal meetings, again, like within your department, talk about the policy, make sure people understand the policy, they know where the policy lives. Um, if you have, I'm just thinking like in, state archives within the different levels. I know there's lots of hierarchical levels. You might bring it up a level to the collections group or the IT group and talk about it with them. And just, it might just be, 5 minutes on an agenda, but at least say, hey, this is done. If you're interested, we've done this. I mean, beyond that, you'd have to get into, how you might present it once you've gotten to that point. But I think to me, it's really just about communicating out as much as you can. And, sometimes I might over communicate, but I don't think that's such a bad thing.
I think so. I think better than not enough.
Yeah.
Um, all right, awesome. Well, I'm seeing some thank yous and some inspiration to write policies and review policies. So thank you so much. And I just have a couple of final slides to share as we wrap up. Share my slides again. All right. So thank you everybody for attending today. We have our website and Twitter and a Facebook page for COSA. There's also a YouTube channel, I believe. So please do stay involved. Oh, and Amy has included her email in the chat. Thank you. And as you exit, there will be a brief survey that you can fill out. So please do, give us evaluation. We read those and it helps, shape our future webinars. So without further ado, let me exit. That was very brief, but thank you everyone for being here today. Thank you so much, Amy, for sharing with us. And we will see you all next time.
Thank you. Take care.